In this part of chapter 4, we're going to be learning all the other ways to factor that we didn't learn before. So far in chapter 3, we learned GCF and we learned basic trinomials. So what we're going to do is add in a few more that you might see. You have to be able to factor in this 4.4, which is solving so that we know where the roots are of any higher order polynomial. Okay, so what we're going to do is first look at what we mean by these things. So when I say them or when the instructions say them, you know what it's talking about. So this is going to be at the top of page 92 in your workbook. And so when it says factor completely, what does that mean? That means factor all the way down until you cannot factor anymore. So it's kind of hard, I guess, to write in words, but it's basically factor until all the way simplified. So all simplified terms is what you should be left with. Okay, now factor by grouping is the one that this video is really going to cover. And so factor by grouping, first of all, is going to have 4 terms. And this is after you have asked for a GCF. So if there's a GCF, you are supposed to take it out, and then you'll continue with the grouping, which I'll show you here in just a little bit. Okay, so you have 4 terms, and then I'll show you the rest. We're not going to put that really into words because it won't really make sense right now. And then quadratic form will just be your basic standard quadratic. Okay, so we'll be talking about all of that in one section, but I'm going to break it into parts. So today is only about grouping, and then you'll learn other types of factoring as we go along. All right, so let's first identify which ones of these would be grouping questions. Number 1 is what we call a trinomial because it has 3 terms. Now I can see that there's a GCF. We will be factoring that, but right now we're trying to pull out the grouping style questions. So 1 would not be a grouping, 2 would not be a grouping. It will be something else. Once we get to it, we'll fill those in. 3 also would be a binomial, so that's not it. We're looking more for something like 4 that has 4 terms. Okay, and then 5 would not be, and then 6 would be. So right now, what we're going to do with all of the example questions is pick out the grouping, solve those, and then we'll go back as we learn other ones to fill in the rest. If you notice on the next page, we also have numbers 8 and 10, which should now stand out to you as another grouping type of question. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to start with 8 and 10 because they're a little more basic than 4 and 6. So we'll go back and do those in a little bit. All right, so what we want to do in 8, we notice that they have the 4 terms. We're always going to ask, is there a GCF first? Now, when I look at this, I do not see a GCF in all 4 terms. Now there is in the first 2 and the second 2. That's why this is called grouping, because I'm going to group the first 2 together and I'm going to group the last 2 together. Now notice this where the a squared is, there's a negative in front of that. Anytime there's a negative, I put the parenthesis around that too, because I need you to look at it as 2 different terms and what they have in common. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do in the first set of parentheses, I'm going to take out the GCF. In this case, my GCF is going to be a cubed. So I'm left with a squared plus 1. Okay, so take a moment and let that sink in and remind yourself of how GCF works. Now my goal is to be left with an a squared plus 1 in the second. In order for grouping to work, the 2 leftovers have to be the same. So here I'm going to take a negative 1 out. And the reason I'll take out a negative 1 is because that will change both of these signs. That will make that an a squared plus 1. And I thought a little bit ahead to know to do that. But now what happens is once these guys match, I'll show you this part. Once that and this match, it's almost like pulling them out as a GCF by themselves. So I would do this like a squared plus 1 is the GCF. So I'm taking that out of these 2 as long as they match. And I'm left over with a cubed minus 1. Now later in this section, we're going to learn how to factor a cubed minus 1, but that's in a different video. So once we get to that portion, you'll kind of know how to, what we call factor completely, because that one could be factored more just by this part. Okay, but right now we haven't gotten to that yet. We're going to do a little bit at a time. All right, number 10, same thing. We're going to take I notice there's no GCF in all of them. So I'm going to put the first two together and the last two together. I'm going to take out a 5z squared. That is my greatest common in both. So that leaves me with z plus 1. So in the next set, my goal is to be left with a z plus 1. And I can already see that as long as I take out a -6, that won't be a problem. I'll be left with z plus 1. No big deal. So now that these two match, I pull them out as one term, like this. And then I'm left with the 5z squared minus 6. Okay, so what I just showed you is two basic grouping questions that don't have a common GCF. On the next page, you're going to go back to 4 and 6, and you're going to look at ones that actually do have a GCF in them. Okay, so on the next page here, now let's actually solve these two questions. Okay, so remember the first step in factoring is to always ask for a GCF. In number 4, we actually have a GCF. If you note, not in the 5s and the 2s, but in t to the third. So we have a GCF of t to the third. And if I take that out of each term, I'm going to be left with 5t to the third plus 2t squared minus 5t and then minus 2. Okay, so my first step to factoring is done, which is the GCF step. Now I want to take this middle term, get another color here. I want to take this part here and factor it again. And so since I have the 4 terms, what I'm going to do is what's called grouping. So the way that works is I'm going to group the first 2 terms together and the second 2 terms together. And then I take a GCF out of each one of those. So in the first set of numbers, I have a GCF of t squared. Okay, now I'm leaving this t to the third until later. That's just a common factor that I'm going to tack on at the end. Okay, so this will be t squared. If I take that out, I'm left with 5t plus 2. And that's only out of the first 2 terms here. Now what I'm going to do is in the second 2 set of terms, my goal is to get a 5t plus 2 again. So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to factor out a -1, which is going to leave me with a positive 5t and a positive 2. So now I have this one and this one that match, which I can again pull out as a greatest common factor. So I'm going to have these two come together as one term, 5t plus 2. And then these two come together because now they're left over when I take that 5t plus 2 out. Just don't forget your bottom, I'm sorry, your original GCF, which will be t cubed. Okay, now when I look at that, the first thing I think is it factored completely? And I would say, no, it's not factored completely because I have one more thing I could do to this t squared minus 1. That is a difference of squares. And so I can write and put my final answer down here on the bottom. The final answer would be t to the third. I can't do anything with that. T squared minus 1, though, is t minus 1, t plus 1. And then I'm left with the 5t plus 2. Okay, now that was a whole lot to take in. So please, if you need to get this all in your notes, go back and watch that portion again if that's something that you need to see over again. But what you have there in the bottom part in blue is factored completely all the way down. Now, we'll get into difference of squares. If you didn't quite get that part, I will do a little bit of a review on that later when we do trinomials. Okay, but either way, that's an easy one to learn. Okay, so the next question, in number 6, we have a greatest common factor again of 5. So I'm going to take that out of each term. So I'm left with p to the third plus p, and then minus p squared, and then minus 1. Okay, so that's my GCF step so far. Now we're going to come back through and do grouping to just this part. Okay, so the grouping would be group the first 2 and the last 2. So I would have p out of the first 2, my GCF would be p. I'm left with p squared plus 1. The next one, I would take out a negative 1. So then I'm left with p squared plus 1 again. Remember, the goal is to get these two to match. All right, so my answer would look like p minus 1 from here and here times p squared plus 1. And then I'm going to drop down this 5. That's it. That's all I can do with that one. That one is not a difference of squares. So it is done. You just want to look for it to be factored completely, and that one is.